Hi everyone, Miss Howard here for our last RPS at home for history and social science in 8th grade. Today we're going to be talking about civil rights, which flows really nicely. Last week we were talking about civic virtue, and this time it's going to be rights. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Part 1 today is all about civil rights today, and Ms. Green is going to continue that on Thursday. Again, both of us are Albert Hill teachers, but we've really enjoyed getting to know you over the past couple of weeks, whether you are an Albert Hill Tiger or otherwise. We love RPS and we love you. So let's get checked in before we start. How are you feeling? Do you need to grab a snack or some water? Been working really hard and need to take a quick break? Are you in a space that's productive? Maybe you need to move, or if you can't move, can you put in some headphones? Go ahead and do that now. And how are you mentally? Maybe you were breathing with the image. If I prompt you well, you know you can breathe with it, inhale and exhale, and calm yourself down. We are going to be talking about some harder topics today, and we'll have warnings about that as we go through. Well, I wouldn't really say warnings, but we just want to make sure you feel good. We know there's a lot going on in the world right now, and it can be kind of difficult to be thinking about rights. Sometimes that's a topic that might upset you. So if that's not your thing today, not feeling it right now, hey, it's more important that you feel good and you feel safe and you feel loved, because you are. Okay, so if everything's good, let's check out our agenda. We're going to go over our lesson goals and the word of the day. We're going to talk about civil rights and do a deep dive with an example. We'll have a quick quiz. I'll give you your mission for today, and then we will close and say goodbye. So are you ready? Let's go. By the end of this lesson, our goals are that you should be able to both identify and explain some examples of current civil rights issues, and with Ms. Green, create a solution in writing. What do you think could be done to solve some of those civil rights problems? So for this lesson, you're going to need something to write with, paper or a notebook that you've been using, and then a brain that's ready to put in some work. Ready? Okay, if not, you can pause it and go get it, and I'll see you back in a second. Now, our word of the day, go ahead and write it down, is civil rights. Something we talk about a lot in this country. We're America, we love our rights, right? We're going to be talking about what that really means today. So, what are civil rights? Technically, it is the rights of citizens to both political and social freedom and equality, so equal treatment. It basically, civil rights guarantees that all citizens have equal social opportunities, for education and advancement, and also protection under the law, regardless of their race, religion, gender, or a whole bunch of other characteristics. It's basically the right to be free from discrimination. Now you see I have a little picture down there of someone that has civil liberties on the side. Let me just kind of explain this really quickly. So, in American vernacular, how we talk, our everyday talk, we usually use the words civil rights and civil liberties interchangeably, like they're the same thing. And that's fine, really it's fine. But truly, legally, there is a difference. So the difference between a civil right and a civil liberty is that civil liberties are protections against the government doing something to the people. So you might think of examples in the Bill of Rights, like basically the First Amendment, right? Government is not allowed to abridge the freedom of the press or abridge the freedom of speech. The government can't come in and say, don't talk about this, don't print this, or you have to do this kind of religion. That's something we would call a civil liberty. Now, civil right means that you are trying to access those liberties, but something is happening on the discrimination side. Civil rights is more about a majority of people deciding that this class of people or that group of people can't have that equal protection, okay? So it's really similar and we use it all the time, and you know what, it's fine. You can go on the rest of your life calling them the same thing, but I just want you to know technically they're actually different. And a lot of times when we think about civil rights and civil liberties, we're thinking about more than just the right to vote. We're thinking about, I love this little picture I found of someone who drew it online, the right to learn, right? The right to own land, the right to be able to have equal pay for your work. It can be really broad, okay? So if you copied all that down, great. If you need to pause it and keep writing, that's fine too. I'm gonna keep moving. So why does this even matter? A lot of times Americans tend to hear the phrase civil rights, and immediately you probably have some of these images that I found pop up into your mind. They immediately tend to think about a specific moment in American history, which you can see is a capital C, capital R, civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which was all about ending Jim Crow, ending segregation and discrimination against African Americans that have been around since, well, you could really say slavery, but it continued after the end of slavery. So a lot of times people will think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. I got her down there. John Lewis and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and people at lunch counters and freedom rides. And that's great. That's all great. Yes, civil rights, true. When I typed this in Google and I typed in civil rights to find some great pictures, these are all the pictures that popped up. But here's the problem. This limits what civil rights really is. The truth is that the fight for civil rights did not begin with Martin Luther King Jr., did not begin with Rosa Parks, nor has it ended after that movement ended in the 1900s. The fight for civil rights has been around really since the beginning of humanity, and certainly since the beginning of our country. And it's an ongoing fight, and it covers more than just racial injustice. A lot of times we think about human rights now when we think about civil rights, that it's something that we've been fighting for a long time, that as humans, we need to make sure that every person, regardless of race, creed, color, original kind of citizenship, where they're coming from, none of that should be a reason for discrimination. So I just want you to remember that when we think about the word civil rights, try to resist automatically thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. and the stuff you learned in American history. It is much broader than that. And for example, on June 26th of 2015, Supreme Court had a really important decision in a case called Obergefell versus Hodges. That was a landmark civil rights case for LGBTQ plus Americans, granting them equal marriage rights. This is the case that said gay marriage has to be recognized in all states as a legal right? Because liberties versus rights. These people were being discriminated against and were not given the same legal protection that marriage gives to men and women. Women and women, men and men could not have that same protection in some states, right? So this became a civil rights issue. So when the LGBTQ community talks about civil rights, they could be thinking about something different than just the 1950s and 1960s. Furthermore, this is still going on today. As our country and our society becomes more diverse, our challenge is to figure out how are we going to continue to ensure that every citizen continues to enjoy the freedom and equality that our country was founded on, right? We talk about that all the time. America is about freedom and equality for all, right? The truth is that the work of civil rights is everybody's work. Everybody's work, whether you feel like you're discriminated against or not. And it is never done. It is ongoing. We can't stop and say, yeah, we did it, let's move on. It is ongoing. And, we talk a lot about how, we've mentioned our founders a lot, I know, in these lessons. And while we don't go into specifics about who those men are, that's a history lesson. Just remember this. They were not perfect men, right? Nobody is, but they really weren't perfect guys, right? But the great thing is that their ideals, the things that they put into the Constitution, we the people, is way bigger than even they understood, right? The people today means way more people than they thought then. And it is those ideals that we are trying to uphold and protect for every person when we think about the fight for civil rights. Does that make sense? This stuff is really important because it didn't start or it didn't end. It's an ongoing work. Okay, now, we are going to take a deep dive, and I'm going to give you some background, some statistics about one civil rights fight that has been going on for a long time and is getting a lot more attention now for criminal justice. So we're going to be talking about prisons, we're going to be talking about arrests, and if that's something you're not able to deal with now, that's fine. I know it can be hard sometimes. I have family members in prison as well. But I want to use this as an example because it's a really good example of something that we don't often think about that is a civil rights issue, okay? So if you're sticking with me, let's go. Write down civil justice reform, excuse me, criminal justice reform, criminal justice reform. First, what is criminal justice? What is a criminal justice system? We didn't do a lot of lessons on the courts in these lessons, but hopefully you covered those in class before we left. But criminal justice, that system is a series of government agencies and institutions that should work to deliver justice to those who have been accused of committing crimes, right? Not everybody who's been accused of committing a crime actually committed the crime, right? So when we think about criminal justice and the criminal justice system, we think about police. We also think about courts and judges and lawyers and prosecutors. And we also think about lawmakers because they make a lot of the laws that determine what the punishments are for certain crimes, right? Now, criminal justice reform, maybe you've heard the word reform before. Reform means that it's referring to efforts that are currently underway and have been started for a long time, but are still being worked out, right? The work of criminal justice, civil rights is never done, that are trying to make the system more just and more equitable, trying to fix the problems. So some examples of issues that criminal justice advocates fight for are changing how drugs and drug crimes are processed in our country. A lot of times there are a lot of people who haven't committed they haven't done any kind of violent act, but they had some drug on them and that gets them sent away to prison for a very long time. There's a lot of people who think that's unfair. An over-reliance on incarceration. That incarceration means being put into prison. There's other ways that we could punish people. There's other ways that we could make them accountable for their actions instead of putting them in prison, but we tend not to do that. Racial bias in the system, juvenile justice reform, things dealing with the school to prison pipeline. Maybe you've heard that phrase before, or how we tend to treat certain juveniles a lot harsher than others. And then keeping prisoners humane once they're in prison. Are they treated fairly? Do they have access to good food and health care? These are all types of issues that fall under criminal justice reform. So I want you to take a look at this interesting graph. What do you see as the title of this graph? What would be the whole title for this little chart? Yes, incarceration rates among founding NATO countries, that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established after the end of World War II. So these are all other nations that are large, stable democracies, right? Kind of comparison countries in some ways to the United States. And you see that this is the incarceration rate per 1,000 population, or 100,000. So out of 100,000 people, how many people in Portugal are in prison? Out of 100,000 people, how many people in Iceland are in prison? As you can see, it's pretty shocking. The United States is completely off that chart, right? In comparison to other stable world democracies, the United States incarcerates or puts in prison more people per capita than any other country. Now, some people might say that, oh, well, we have more murder to deal with, or we have more, and that doesn't hold up. A lot of the world data shows that even countries that have similar murder rates, whether they're democracies or not, we tend to put them in prison a lot more here. And another way to think about that is that, look at Virginia though. If you add Virginia to this map, we bump to the top. For our 100,000 people in Virginia, we actually put 779 of them, of those people, just citizens, are in prison rather than free, which is higher than the United States average. Not great. Another way to think about it is that the United States only has 5% of the world population. We're not, well, I guess that's pretty substantial when you think about all the nations, but we're really not a very, super large nation like China or India, right? But we still have 22% of the world's prisoners, right? So if you were to count how many prisoners are in the world, 22% of them would go in America alone. Just a comparison of that makes me a little uncomfortable. I don't know how it makes you feel, but I don't like to think about that many people being in prison. It makes me think that maybe something might be wrong here, right? What about this? So this is a type of chart that we haven't seen yet in our lessons. Does anybody know what this is? Maybe you learned about it in math or science. Yeah, this is a scatter plot chart or scatter plot graph. And the way it works is it actually puts a dot of data. Each of those little dots is one piece of data. So this scatter plot is showing us the number of people from a slice of New York, the state of New York, that are incarcerated. So it's saying that on the bottom, if you look at the y-axis, that if your community is more likely to have higher rates of poverty, you see the trend is going up, right? You're more likely to see more people imprisoned in those communities. So the main takeaway there to write down is for our criminal justice system, people who live in poor communities are more likely to be put into prison. Furthermore, people who are often jailed, and what the term they like to use, all of this is from the Prison Policy Initiative, which is a really interesting website, has a lot of really interesting graphs, makes it easy to understand it. So if you're interested about this issue, I really recommend that. They use the term frequent utilizers, and that means someone, that's the term we'd use for someone who's been arrested 3 or more times and jailed 3 or more times in a year. And you notice that for each of these comparative bar graphs, if you've been arrested more likely, you're more likely to be unemployed. You're more likely to have not had not have graduated high school, and you're likely not to make as much money. So people who are often jailed face economic disadvantages. And I know that might seem like obviously you're in jail, you can't do all these things, but is there a way that maybe we could help them get GEDs and make sure that they can get jobs afterwards? Or are we rehabilitating people? I don't know. That's usually the way that criminal justice advocates think when they see this kind of data. Okay, one more thing. Obviously, this is America, so we have to talk about racial bias as well and racial injustice. So if you look at the top chart there, it has 3 different race ethnicities. It has white, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, and Black. The next column over says how many percentage of the US population is this ethnic group. Next over it says what percentage of those people are incarcerated in the United States out of the population, and then what's the per capita rate, okay? So you can see there which ethnic group out of those 3, white, Hispanic, and Black, have the largest portion of the US population, according to this chart. Right, it has whites at 64%. I believe this data was from like 2000 or 2002, I think, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So I think those numbers have changed a little bit. But you can see that even though whites make up a large part of our population, Blacks, who are only 13% of the US population, far outweigh the incarcerated population. They're only 13% of the US population, and yet 40% of African Americans in our overall population are in prison. And this chart is from 2010, and it shows Virginia's specific incarceration rates. So you can see that if you are Black, you are, in this case, way more likely to be imprisoned. And obviously, you know, people might be like, well, what's the data around all the other stuff? And all of these things layer together, right? If you are economically disadvantaged and you're Black and you didn't finish high school, like all of these things layer on top of each other. But clearly there is a disproportionate, it doesn't seem fair or equal when it comes to incarceration and race in our country. So the note I have there for you to write, underline, is that increased rates of incarceration have profound effects on the communities that are disproportionately imprisoned. So if Black communities are more likely to be put in jail, that really affects their communities, right? That was the main takeaway of this study that the Prison Policy Institute did, is that, listen, set aside whatever else about, you know, how people got there, right? But continuing to put African American men usually in prison really affects their community. Okay, so then this is what I want you to do. This is practice getting you ready for part 2. So here's a question. How does the criminal justice reform movement represent an example of a civil rights movement? How does it actually have anything to do with civil rights, right? How does it concern civil rights? So this is what you have to think of. Remember, a civil right is a right of a citizen to political or social freedom or equality, right? So we have to think, are there problems in our criminal justice system that represent a threat to any citizen's political freedom or social freedom, or their political equality or social equality? All I wanted you to do is write down the question on that, because what I really want us to do is to use a little chart. So I want you to jot down really fast, make 2 columns, one that's way thicker, and give me 3 rows, okay? Sketch that out really fast, pause it if you have to, and then I'll tell you what I want you to put in them. So you can pause now. Okay, with me? Here, let's go. So in that top column, the second column, I want you to put the word freedom and the word equality. We're going to basically kind of chart out, after learning about criminal justice reform, whether these things are political or social freedoms or equality threats. So you see I have unfreedom. So what's an example of an unfreedom that we've learned about in criminal justice system today? Or what's an example of inequality? Okay, so I want you to take a second, or it might take you a couple minutes, that's okay. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to kind of, if you need to, you can go back and rewatch again. And I want you to kind of write down, what's an example of our criminal justice system being politically unfair, politically unequal? And what's an example of it being socially unfree or socially unequal? Now, if this is a little bit hard, that's okay. But remember, if you come up with anything that seems unfair or unequal, it counts as a civil right, okay? So I want you to pause and see what you can do to fill out this chart. And once you're done, you can join me again. Okay, 3, 2, 1, pause. Are you back? Okay, so I had to think about this for a little bit too, and I changed this chart around a whole bunch of different times. But this is what I came up with. I wonder if you wrote some things similar to me. So I was thinking about like political issues. What might result politically from a lot of these unfair factors in our criminal justice system? Well, clearly, we literally take away people's freedom, right? We literally take away their freedom to go about and do whatever they want because they're behind bars. They're incarcerated, right? Also, incarcerated people are actually less likely to vote, and a lot of times they lose their right to vote. In America, if you're a felon, you are not allowed to vote anymore. And although there are a lot of governors, including our Virginia governor, Governor Northam, who have restored some of those rights to felons, you do not have the same political equality. You don't have the same vote that other people do if you're incarcerated, especially if you're a felon. Maybe you had some other ones. I put a question mark there because you might have thought some other things. What about some social inequalities or social unfreedoms in our system? What did you get? These are ones I got. Obviously, we saw that African American people and poor people are more likely to be arrested and are more likely to be in prison. Also, we know from the news going on in our world today that Black and poor people are also more likely to be hurt or killed in police interactions, or they're sometimes given much longer or harsher sentences compared to other races or people who are wealthy. So if you can fill anything out in this chart, then it becomes a civil rights issue. And I don't know if you would think that, because we usually think civil rights, so racial justice, and getting the right to vote, but it's bigger than that. It obviously has to do with our criminal justice system too. So one last thing I want to say about this before we move on is immigration detention and immigration rights. Do immigration detentions, like when we take people in who have come to our country illegally or illegally and they're detained at first, does that count as a civil right issue? Well, the truth is sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Because remember, civil rights have to do with the rights of citizens, right? But a lot of times today, how we are using the term civil liberties and civil rights, we're often using the term human rights interchangeably as well. There are a lot of cases like where if something is on the law books about an immigrant's right once they come to this country, or how we should handle immigrants with the law, then it does become something that's a civil rights issue. But it kind of depends. Obviously, I really like the sign families belong together. And human rights are civil rights. That's something we hear about all the time. But technically, if it's a civil right, it applies to a citizen. Okay, now let's do a quick quiz. See how well you took all that information in. I know that was a lot. I know that was heavy, and it was a lot of chart work too. Good for you for getting through that. That's hard stuff. Okay, here's the first question. See how we do. Civil rights refer to the rights of all of the following, except, so we're looking for the thing that doesn't belong. A right to an education, a right to vote, a right to be hired for a job, or a right to have your marriage legally recognized. So what is the thing that isn't a civil right? Make a choice. What do you think? The best answer here is the right to be hired for a job. That's not something that's like really protected. Now, your right to be, make sure you're not discriminated against when you're being hired at that job, that's a civil right, right? If you feel for whatever reason you didn't get a job because someone acted out in discrimination because of race or your age or your gender or your sexual orientation, any of those things, then it becomes a civil right. But just plain old, I need to get a job, I have the right to a job, that's not really a civil right. Okay, let's keep going. Number 2, talking about criminal justice reform. The United States incarcerates blank people compared to other developed nations. Is it more? Is it less? Or is it about the same? You should know this one fast. What is it? Yeah, we saw that chart, way more, especially when you compare us to other developed, democratic, and stable nations. Last one, number 3. This quote is from Frederick Douglass. It says, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." This quote implies that civil rights only refers to racial injustice, the fight for civil rights will end one day, or rights are an ongoing challenge for all. What do you think? What's the best answer? The best answer is this last one. Civil rights are an ongoing challenge for all. That's why we sometimes call this movement the progressive movement, because it recognizes that this doesn't end. We're continually trying to get better, right? Great, I love that quote. It really applies to civil rights. Okay, let's talk about your mission. So I want you to do a little research about civil rights that you care about. I'm sure there might be a lot going on in the news it's easy to write about, but I want you to do a little research first to prepare for Ms. Green's lesson in part 2. Your mission is to go to www.splcenter.org/issues, and you'll see this is the web page that it should take you to. SPLC is the Southern Poverty Law Center. They deal a lot with rights of with civil rights issues. So I want you to do is just kind of explore some of the topics there. I think they have like 6 to 8 different topics that they really focused on. You can see one that says hate and extremism. The next is children's rights, also really important. And I want you to choose an issue that or a topic that's really interesting to you. And I want you to write in just a few sentences, maybe a paragraph, why that topic interests you and why it's an example of a civil right. So you might want to go back to earlier in this video where we made the chart. Does it have to do with political freedom and equality or social freedom and equality? Then that's something that applies as a civil right. So I want you to think about that as you prepare for Ms. Green's lesson in part 2. Okay, our meme of today is goodbye. This has been a really, really great time. I know a lot of you have sent us in your things, and I appreciate you, and you know we always shout you out, but there won't be another time for us to shout you out, and know that we really love to we've loved looking at your work. We're really proud of the work you've done with us, and we just want to let you know that we really care about you, and we hope you've enjoyed this kind of lesson. So goodbye, but it's not goodbye forever, right? It's just see you later. Okay, guys? Have a great one. And enjoy your summer. If you're watching this and it's not summertime, have a great day. And we'll see you again soon. Bye.